Thanks, Dennis. So keeping with the theme of the meeting, I'll change the title now. So this work was originally put together 5 years after the zoning. Since we're now on the 10th anniversary of the zoning of the Great Barrier Reef, I'll call it an update, a 10-year update, if you like. As Janice said, I work at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. I'm a partner investigator in the Centre of Excellence. But the original work that I'm updating was done whilst I was a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation. So quick word from the sponsors there. And I also really need to acknowledge that this is far from a solo project. What I'm trying to do is integrate a lot of work by a lot of people. There's a list of some of those people. And in particular, it's been a real collaboration between people at Grabumper and the management agency and with the management perspective and a wide range of scientists. So, context, we've heard lots about how the Great Barrier Reef is of enormous environmental value, social, cultural, and we'll talk later about the economic value. But it's also a place of extraordinary beauty. And that beauty is what we code for when we talk about, in bureaucratic speak, outstanding universal value, as John Day outlined for us yesterday. So that outstanding universal value, that extraordinary beauty, is something that we need to protect. But unfortunately, the message, as you've been hearing, is a little bit grim. So this is an inshore reef south of Townsville in about 1890. And 25 years later, you can see that there was a long-term stable, in fact, some work by John Pandolfi's group that I've been privileged to collaborate with has shown that that was probably stable for about 500 years like that. But by the time Dave Wackenfeld got there, that was coincidence, it wasn't cause and effect, in 1994, and then Tara Clark from John's group 20 years later, what we see is that there is a new long-term stable condition with basically a degraded condition. We've heard that the Great Barrier Reef is considered one of the best managed marine protected areas in the world. What this is telling us is that the best is not good enough. And this is also an off-used slide. So what you have along the base of each graph is from 1985 to 2010. It's the time course of coral cover. It's been used a lot for the averaged over the whole Great Barrier Reef or for the north, the central and the south. What we're seeing is major declines, especially in the central and southern Great Barrier Reef. And that's a cause for real concern. We need to be doing something about that. I'm now going to set that in the context of how we try to manage those kinds of things. And in particular, again, we've heard a couple of times about the concept of adaptive management, just to refresh your minds. Adaptive management works by conceptualising the problem, then planning and then implementing not only your response, your management action, but also integrating, monitoring, which will then allow you to analyse and review your effectiveness of your management strategies, which puts you then in a position to adapt and revise the actions and monitoring. So, clearly, those last two steps are really, really important on the Great Barrier Reef right now. And in that context, there's a range of different review processes. The main one that I'll be focusing on today is a review of zoning that we undertook 5 years after the zoning, published in 2010. And I'm now going to try and update for you where I can during the rest of this presentation. But it's also worth noting the other mechanisms, the paddock to reef report cards. These are delivered approximately annually. As John Brodie pointed out yesterday, and the Queensland Government is very keen to emphasise, the glass is 10% full. We've got some success there, and all we really need to do is increase what we're doing there about 10 to 20-fold, and we'd be on track to address that problem. We also have the Outlook Report 2009. This is a 5-yearly report, and the Strategic Assessment produced last year, and then the current Outlook Report, which has just been delivered to the Minister. So those are our different reporting mechanisms which allow us to do or should provide the basis for us to adapt and revise our management. We're going to focus, as I said, on the zoning one. I hate trying to use the mouse. And I just want to emphasise that this is globally significant, and that's why it's actually worth coming back and reviewing it on this 10th anniversary. It's globally significant as a demonstration of the potential benefits that marine protected areas can get. It's scientifically important because it's very large, it's replicated. We've got before-after data, in particular in the form of Dave Williamson's data that Gary Russ talked about this morning. We've got a variety of zones, including no-entry zones. Terry talked about that yesterday. And really importantly, we've got best practice implementation so that that good, high, very transparent and principle-based implementation, which was comprehensive, it's adequate, it's representative, and it's replicated. That means it is a good case study for us to assess what can be achieved rather than what's achieved when you have limitations or inadequate compliance, etc. It's on a regional scale. We have quite a lot of results. When I first pulled this work together, I was quite surprised at the full breadth of work we could pull together. In particular, going from not only the standard fish counts, which are a standard biological measuring, but right through to the human dimensions, compliance and the economics and so on. I do need to point out, and Terry and others emphasised this yesterday, that the processes and the governance arrangements that surround these kinds of programs are really, really important, but I'm not going to incorporate them today, so I'll just acknowledge that importance. Okay, so 5 years after the zoning, I was invited to pull together this synthesis. I collaborated with 21 leading scientists from around the Great Barrier Reef, most of them who did the actual work here. And what was really exciting and novel about this paper was that we could do that broad range that I referred to, from fish, some of the habitat stuff, species of conservation concern, right through to the human dimension, the compliance, the social impacts, the economics. So what I want to do now is try to update that for you where we can, giving you the 10 years on assessment. We'll start with the fish. Gary talked a little bit this morning, but this is the spatial design of the monitoring program that we pulled together. There are 5 offshore areas and 3 onshore or inshore areas rather. Gary talked to you this morning about the inshore areas. The take-home message here is that 10 years after the 2004 zoning, and in some cases a lot longer time courses, we're seeing consistent patterns, subject to some variability, especially here in the Keppels, but consistent patterns of more fish in the protected reserve areas than in the unprotected areas. So that's in the inshore areas. I can update you thanks to Hugh Sweetman, Mike Emsley, and the AIMS long-term monitoring program. On the offshore areas, this is just a much simpler summary of their data, but averaged across the all of those 5 sampling areas, again, we're seeing a consistent long-term increase in the numbers of fish, and in fact, this graph is biomass of fish across the entire system, and over approaching 10 years since the zoning. So, to sum up then, the outcome is that there are more fish in the protected areas. Go figure, who would have expected if you stop fishing, you get more fish? But what's important in the GBR context is that we now have clear, widespread evidence and long-term benefits. There's some of the work we do in that paper shows that it's really important that you have good compliance, however, and it just illustrates some of the drawbacks, even on the Great Barrier Reef, of inadequate compliance and the importance of enforcement. I think Gary mentioned this morning that some of Dave Williamson's work, coupled with earlier surveys by Tony Ayling, has shown just that in the inshore Great Barrier Reef, by as early as 30 years ago now, it appears that fish stocks on those inshore reefs were already significantly depleted to the levels that we now find in the fished areas. Back. Now, I've emphasised there that the fish are not only more abundant, but they're bigger. And that becomes really important when we start thinking, about the network of marine reserves and the entire ecosystem. Because as many of you know much better than me, bigger fish have more larvae. They have disproportionately more larvae. And as Hugo showed us a few minutes ago, that's been really important on the GBR, because essentially what it looks like in the Keppels and that area is that something like 3/4 of the larvae of the fish going into the ecosystem in that area are coming from the reserve zones that constitute only about 1/3 of the area. So that's really important. Hugo also showed us with the work with Jeff and their many collaborators just how many of the connections are taking place. And so that's important in the context of this ecosystem-wide perspective. We're seeing that the networks are connected to other networks. That's the 43% over there. The networks are connected, so we're seeing not an isolated system of, a system of isolated reserves, but those reserves are functioning as a network, and that's important because networks are far more resilient than systems of isolated components. But we're also seeing benefits for the entire ecosystem, because our job at Grabumpa is not to look after 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, it's to look after the entire ecosystem. And we can see that with the connectivity between the reserves and the non-reserves areas, we're having that benefit across the entire ecosystem and benefits for fisheries as well. So that's really important, but it's all focused on coral reefs. Something like 95% of the area of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is not coral reefs, it's other ecosystems. This is some data from Mike Capo at AIMS, where they use baited remote underwater video to assess fish numbers. And again, what you see is that in the green bars, the reserve areas, you see generally more fish than in the fished areas. Even in those non-reef areas. Now, I need to emphasise that these results vary enormously with species, with regions, within regions, with sites, and a whole bunch of other factors. And I need to emphasise that, and I want you to all raise your hand that you've heard me say that, please. Okay? Because I've been accused of suppressing that variability in some of the skeptic responses to this paper. So we're just documenting it. What about the rest of those seafloor habitats, though? This is some work carried out led by Roland Pitcher in the Seabed Biodiversity Study. The rest of the Great Barrier Reef is not as picture postcard pretty, but it is also mega diverse, and that diversity is really important. So how have we gone protecting that? Well, there was a bit of a challenge for the Marine Park Authority when John Day and his team were putting this together, because we discovered that we didn't have sufficient knowledge of the seafloor biodiversity patterns to actually form the basis for the zoning. So that had two consequences. Firstly, the need to use physical proxies to predict biodiversity patterns. So that's things like sediment types, latitude, cross-shelf position, depth, etc., to predict biodiversity. But the second was to actually address that knowledge gap, and that was the Seabed Biodiversity Study, a major multi-agency collaborative program, thousands of survey sites, and a major increase in our knowledge of the biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef. That then meant that we were in a position with that new knowledge to go back and do a retrospective analysis, and this is what Roland Pitcher at CSIRO led, a retrospective analysis of how well the zoning plan had addressed seafloor biodiversity. And what their results show is that looking at different measures or different aggregations of biodiversity, we find that at least 20% of those biodiversity groupings were in no trawl zones for every different biodiversity type under the new zoning plan. And that amounted to approximately 30% increase over the levels of protection pre-2004. So I think that's really exciting because it's an outcome of good process. It's an unexpected outcome or hopefully an expected outcome. That is really important, and it's really important because the alternative would have been to have waited until we'd done the seabed biodiversity study and then used that information as the basis for the zoning. There would have only been one relatively major drawback to that, and that is that the political landscape would have changed so much in that time that we probably wouldn't have got the zoning across the line. Okay, so that's all about the biota, but what about the effects on people? One of the major concerns at the time the zoning was being brought in is that it would devastate fisheries, especially, and a lot of concern about the impacts on recreational fishing. So one of the major investments of any recreational fisher, probably the major investment, is a small boat to go out fishing, such as you see here. And this graph shows you the registrations of those small vessels from December 01 through to June 09. And what the concern was that the zoning would have a major impact on this. So let's actually have a look at what the evidence shows us. And what you see is that the zoning had no impact on that pattern at all. It's an almost linear ongoing increase. I can update that for you now. This is the same graph taken out to December last year. And the point I want to emphasise here is the importance of actually bringing the information to bear on those kinds of assumptions and assertions that we hear in the public discourse a great deal. And following on from that, the final slide, the same applies to actually examining the economic kinds of issues, because we hear a lot of claims about that. So this graph shows you the revenue generated by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park as estimated by Access Economics, an independent economic consulting firm. And it shows you the initial data that we included in the paper on the left-hand side there. It shows you the zoning plan brought in 2004. And the amount of money is extraordinary. It's around $5.5 billion. We can update that now for the 2011-12 financial year, 5.7, so a small increase, but quite a significant increase in the employment based on the Great Barrier Reef. It's nearly 69,000 jobs based on the reef economy. Now, that's pretty important. But, and it's worth noting that the lion's share of that is generated by the tourism industry. Unfortunately, Daniel just left, but I was going to give him a plug there. But what I particularly want to emphasise here is that those black bars you can see along the bottom axis there, those are the costs of running the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority throughout that same period. And you can see that there has actually been a slight increase, but relative to the revenue generated by the Marine Park, you can't even see that there. The Marine Park Authority, we estimated 0.7 of 1%. Most recently, that would be about 0.9 of 1%. So it's less than 1% of what the Marine Park is generating. And if you look at the enforcement, which is the part most relevant to zoning, that's about 1/3% we spend looking after the zoning of the revenue generated. Even at the time the zoning was brought in, there was, and subsequently when the national campaign was underway, there was a lot of criticism because the structural adjustment package for the zoning ended up being a lot more expensive than anticipated. It cost $211 million. But even that amount of money here only amounts to about less than 4% of a single, so that's a once-off cost. The revenue is an annual revenue, and it's less than 4% of 1 year's revenue. To bring you absolutely up to date, the Grabumper budget has been decreased by about 9% for the next financial year, the financial year we've just started. In the context of the whole of the national government, that's actually relatively small. And if you take the long-term trajectory, we've been doing relatively well. But if you put it in the context of a more business-like context, you'll see that it's interesting considering that as a cost in the context of the revenue that the marine park generates. Okay, so I'll wrap up then. The conclusion that we originally drew was that the zoning plan was having significant ecosystem benefits. Well, the more up-to-date data suggests that that's an ongoing conclusion. The benefits to tourism and to fisheries, as Hugo Harrison's presentation showed us a few minutes ago. That seems to be an ongoing. In fact, we're getting a clearer picture of that as Jeff and Hugo and the team give us a better, clearer picture of that. It's highly cost effective, and that is extending, continuing, and an ongoing conclusion. We always emphasise that the zoning is only one part of the things we need to do to protect the reef. And whilst it's really important as a global demonstration of what a good reserve network and a well-implemented reserve network can achieve, we also need to put that in the context of the more recent results coming out of the strategic assessment and the outlook report. Although the zoning has been highly successful, the reef overall is still declining, and we need those complementary management issues. We need a major step up in those kinds of management efforts. So I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to, and John Day, I think, is here. He was certainly here yesterday. Hi, John. He led the team, Leanne Fernandez, and a whole raft of people, and it was very much a team effort. But the outcomes for the Great Barrier Reef, I think, really illustrate what is possible with really robust, careful, principle-based process. And the other point I want to make from this presentation is just what good outcomes are possible with a really tight synergy between research and science and management, which has been part of the zoning as well as this assessment from the very beginning. But with the challenges that we're seeing into the future, and with a new centre kicking off here at this symposium, I think we need to really continue to strengthen the interplay between the science and the research and the management into the future, because we've got our work cut out for us.